I relocated to what seemed like just another peaceful residential area until I encountered Karen. She's the type of person who believes she controls the whole street, complete with her fabricated homeowner association regulations and wannabe law enforcement officers patrolling as if they owned the territory. Little did she know the kind of person she was dealing with. As a federal agent, I don't tolerate intimidation easily. However, what transpired afterward, let's simply say events became far more heated than she anticipated. Before we begin, please share your location with us today. I was awakened by aggressive banging on my front door, so forceful that my windows appeared to vibrate. Still groggy, I rushed to the entrance, thinking someone might need help. Looking through the peephole, I observed two individuals dressed in identical uniforms bearing bold lettering that spelled HOA Police. Their badges appeared inexpensive, resembling costume accessories, yet they maintained an upright posture and stared at me with serious expressions. My heartbeat quickened more than it should have at daybreak. I cracked the door slightly and asked, "How may I assist you?" The larger officer, a man with angular features, gestured toward me. "We're here conducting official duties," he announced. "Your residence has several infractions and we must examine your garage." Irritation surged through me. "What do you mean? There's nothing in my garage that violates any regulations." The smaller officer, a woman with piercing eyes, responded sharply. "Don't complicate this situation. We have jurisdiction from the HOA. I observed they made no mention of warrants or actual police involvement." Speaking calmly, I stated, "I'm a federal agent. If you have legitimate grounds, present me with proper documentation." This caused the tall one to smirk. "Being FBI doesn't exempt you from community regulations." Just then, I noticed movement behind them. Karen, my neighbor, peered over their shoulders wearing a self-satisfied expression. She had consistently been noisy and demanding, complaining about every minor issue in our area. I immediately knew she must have orchestrated this little performance, and my stomach churned with concern. Moving onto my porch, I maintained a steady voice. "Karen, what's happening here?" She raised her chin. "Oh, I'm simply ensuring regulations are enforced," she said, her tone filled with artificial sweetness. "You cannot claim special privileges due to your profession." The fake officers agreed. "We have reports of unusual activity in your garage," the female officer stated. I released a strained laugh. "Unusual activity such as what?" Karen shrugged. "I detect it sounds late at night, could be anything. You might be storing dangerous materials, or perhaps you're planning something." My jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous and you're aware of it. If there's a legitimate issue, I'll come plea, but this constitutes harassment." The tall officer produced a paper that resembled a typed form. There was no official seal, no signature. Just text claiming I was under investigation by the HOA police. I attempted to remain composed. "That's not a legitimate document. You both have no authority to force entry." Karen released a theatrical sigh. "Are you certain you want to argue? I can include your refusal in the list of infractions." I glared at her. "Since when does the HOA deploy its own police force? I've resided here long enough to know we only have volunteers who monitor yards and paint colors." The shorter officer displayed a plastic-looking badge in my face. "We have new authority now." "Step aside." I shook my head. "Absolutely not. Unless you return with actual law enforcement and a legitimate warrant, you're not entering my residence." The man stepped forward. "Don't challenge us." I felt my anger rise, but I suppressed it. As a federal agent, I knew better than to initiate a physical confrontation on my porch. Instead, I crossed my arms. "If you attempt to enter here, you'll be the ones facing charges." Karen smirked again. "You can't intimidate us. Everyone on this street knows you think you're superior to the rules." Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Glancing at the screen, I saw my supervisor's name flashing. My stomach tightened. I had never received a call from him so early. "One moment," I told the fake officer, stepping back into my entryway. The tall man shouted after me, "We're not finished here." Ignoring him, I took the call. My supervisor's voice sounded strained. "Jet to the office immediately. We have a situation." My heart dropped. "Is this regarding some complaint against me?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I'll explain in person." I hung up and returned to the door. The two fake cops were still there, with Karen looming behind them as if she owned the property. "I must leave," I said. "I'll address this later." The woman officer shook her head. "If you depart, we'll record you as non-compliant." Karen stepped closer, her gaze cold. "Do you want your neighbors to witness you fleeing?" I siren. "This is absurd. You know you cannot arrest me." She tilted her head. "I'm not arresting you. They are, and I'm not preventing them." The male officer raised plastic zip ties as if he intended to restrain me. I had to remind myself to maintain composure. "Put those down," I said. "Impersonating a law officer is a crime. You're aware of that, correct?" The woman officer grabbed her radio, but I questioned whether it actually connected to any real dispatch. Karen clicked her tongue. "You might want to listen. They have the authority to cite you." My jaw tightened. "A fake citation means nothing." The tall man waved the zip ties in my face. "Do you want to discover if these are fake too?" At that moment, I realized how extreme this had become. They wanted to provoke me into doing something reckless. It was a trap, plain and simple. I forced myself to back down, taking a slow breath. "Look," I said, "I'm stepping away to handle an urgent matter at my actual job. You all need to vacate my property." Karen shrugged. "We'll be monitoring. The HOA has surveillance." That made me laugh out loud. "The real HO might, but you certainly aren't it." The male officer pressed his lips into a thin line. "We'll give you one final warning." Then he glanced at Karen, who nodded. "If you don't comply, we'll recommend disciplinary action." I glared at them. "Recommend it to whoever you wish. Now leave my porch." They retreated, but not before the woman snapped a photograph of me with her phone. Karen gave me a mocking smile. "Smile for the records." My stomach churned. I waited for them to step off my lawn, then slammed the door. My phone buzzed again, another message from my supervisor. My entire body felt tense, like a spring ready to snap. This was precisely what I didn't need, especially if something serious was occurring at the bureau. Yet these counterfeit officers had thrown my morning into chaos, and Karen's grin still lingered in my mind. It took me 10 minutes to calm down before I finally grabbed my keys and headed out. The fake cruiser was parked at the end of the street, its lights off. I noticed Karen's car was gone, which meant she might be prowling around elsewhere, possibly telling neighbors a distorted version of the story. I drove away, trying to steady my breathing. My supervisor's tone on the phone had sounded urgent, and that rattled me even more than Karen's antics. As I pulled onto the main road, I caught myself checking the mirror repeatedly, half expecting that HOA police car to follow me, but there was no sign of them. Still, I felt trapped between two nightmares: the phony cops who wanted to corner me at home, and something big looming at work. I reached the FBI field office and headed inside. My supervisor stood in the hallway, looking rigid and anxious. "You took your sweet time," he snapped, then waved me into his office. I shut the door behind us, my heart in my throat. He demanded to know why local authorities were complaining about my threatening behavior. I explained the situation, emphasizing how those officers had no real badges and that Karen was behind it. He stared at me for a long moment. "Well, we have a problem," he said. "Higher-ups have flagged this. There's talk of misconduct, and I can't protect you if it escalates." My stomach dropped. "But I'm innocent," I insisted. "Someone's framing me, or at least trying to push me out." He rubbed his eyes. "I don't care if they're real cops or not. There's paperwork claiming you resisted a lawful inspection. It's all nonsense, but it's on my desk now." I felt a flush of anger rising up my neck. Karen must have sent it. She's got some crazy plan. He let out a slow sigh. "Like I said, I can't do much if official complaints keep coming. Keep your cool. Prove they're fake. Otherwise, you'll be dealing with an internal review." Panic flared, but I nodded, knowing there was no quick fix. As I left his office, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a blocked number. "Better watch your step. We know who you are." I nearly crushed my phone in my hand. These people were trying to destroy my life, and now they had found a way to make it look official. I trudged through the day, haunted by the morning's clash and the sinking feeling that Karen had taken her petty rules to a sick new level. Even some of my co-workers shot me strange looks, like they'd already heard rumors. Before I left for home, I stopped by the break room where an agent named Davis pulled me aside. "Got a second?" he asked quietly. "Sure," I said. He glanced around, checking if anyone was listening. "I overheard something in passing. Word is you're on thin ice. You might want to watch your back." My chest tightened. "You mean watch my back here or in my neighborhood?" Davis frowned. "Both, maybe. And I'd keep an eye on that Karen lady. She's bragging about getting you in trouble." By the time I left the building, the sun was sinking low in the sky. I drove home with my nerves on edge, wondering if those fake officers would be on my street again. When I turned onto my block, sure enough, I saw a strange SUV parked near my house. Its tinted windows made me shiver. I parked, got out, and eyed the SUV, but the engine was off and nobody stepped out. Keeping my breathing steady, I hurried inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains. Almost right away, my phone dinged with an email notification. It was from the Bureau's internal affairs team, asking me to explain my morning altercation with the local security detail. I dropped onto my sofa in a daze. Karen had found a way to link her phony patrol with real authorities, and now my job was on the line. Even though the so-called HOA officers had left my house earlier, they still lurked in my neighborhood, and the Bureau was pressing me for answers. With Karen stirring up trouble at every turn, I sensed that the storm around me was only getting stronger, and I had no clue how far her scheme would reach. I got home later that day and saw the same fake HOA police cruiser idling at the end of my street. My pulse sped up as I parked, but I forced myself to act normal. Once inside, I peeked through the blinds. The car stayed put, like it was daring me to confront it again. I checked my messages, hoping for a response from the real HOA or some sign that Karen's hoax was collapsing. Instead, I found nothing but a bounced email and a threatening voicemail. The muffled voice warned, "We know you're digging. Back off, or this gets worse." That single line told me Karen wasn't alone in this plan. The next day, I tried calling the official HOA number listed on an old newsletter, but my call went straight to a recorded message about technical difficulties. Frustrated, I fired off an email titled, "Urgent Possible Impersonation," only to have it bounce back as undeliverable. I even checked the neighborhood website. It showed out-of-date information and no mention of any new security measures. It felt like Karen had shut down every communication channel, leaving me with no official recourse. I decided to reach out to a local police contact named Alvarez, a no-nonsense officer who sometimes traded intel with the Bureau. Over the phone, I summarized the situation: fake badges, bogus citations, and a neighbor leading the charge. Alvarez sounded skeptical but promised to investigate the license plate of the so-called HOA vehicle. "If it belongs to a private security firm," he said, "they can't legally act as law enforcement." As I waited for Alvarez's call back, the tension in my own block kept rising. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before now whispered behind their fences, eyeing me like I was the villain. One morning, Tamara, one of the few people who still talked to me, knocked on my door looking pale and frantic. "They left this on my porch," she said, holding up a notice demanding a fine for unapproved paint colors. I skimmed the text and recognized the same funny language they'd aimed at me, warning about forced eviction if she didn't pay. She looked ready to cry. I called the HOA for help, but the line was dead. Is Karen even allowed to do this? My anger flared. "No, this is a scam," I said, wishing I had a solution. "Don't pay them. I'll figure this out." But she only shrugged, fear in her eyes. I can't risk losing my home. If nobody's stopping them, then maybe it's real. Meanwhile, work at the FBI became a minefield. My supervisor called me in for an update, his voice tight with frustration. I'm getting more reports of your conflicts with local authorities, he said, tapping a folder on his desk. Care to explain? I did my best to detail Karen's phony cops and show him the worthless citations they had slapped me with, but he frowned and shrugged. If they claim to be private security, I can't make all this vanish. Higher-ups are asking questions, and they're not pleased. That left me feeling cornered. Even if the so-called HOA police were fakes, the noise they made was echoing at the bureau. I couldn't afford more trouble. Every day I worried about an email or phone call telling me I was officially under investigation. One evening I spotted Karen standing in her driveway, arms folded, as she watched me pull in. I stepped out of my car and marched straight up to her, ignoring the nervous flutter in my stomach. We need to talk, I said. She just raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. I kept my tone cool. You've set these fake officers on me and now you're targeting innocent neighbors. Why? She flashed a thin smile. It's not personal. People around here forget that we have standards. I'm just making sure we enforce them. I clenched my fists at my sides. By scaring everyone. That's not how this works. She shrugged. They don't seem scared to me. They pay the fines, they follow rules, and life goes on. My anger simmered. Endgame. She tilted her head as though confused by my question. Endgame? I'm just cleaning up the neighborhood. You're the one refusing to cooperate. Before I could respond, one of the Fox cops strolled over, giving me a stern look. Move along, he ordered. We have business with Miss Karen. My jaw tightened. You have no legal authority here. He lifted a flimsy badge and smirked. We're all the authority we need. Rather than argue, I stepped back, not wanting to give them another excuse to file a complaint. Karen shot me a final smug glance before they walked off together, leaving me fuming in the street. That night, I tried to calm down by reviewing old HA documents from my filing cabinet. I found a reference to a once-proposed security program that never got approved. Karen's name was listed as a main advocate. The plan had been tabled when residents decided they didn't want a military-style presence in the neighborhood. Now it seemed she'd created her own version using any means necessary. A deep chill ran down my spine. She could hijack an entire community. Maybe she had friends in high places too. Friends who could make real trouble for me at the FBI. A few days later, Alvarez finally called back. That plate belongs to a private security outfit, but I can't find any license contract with your HOA, he said, sounding more certain now. They're acting without approval. I let out a breath I'd been holding. This is proof they're not real cops, I said, relief mixing with anger. But how do I tie it to Karen? He hesitated. I can't dig deeper unless there's an official complaint on file, and so far, there isn't. My frustration boiled over. This is an official complaint. I'm telling you they threatened me on my property. Alvarez sighed. I believe you, but I need statements from other neighbors who will back you up. Otherwise, it's your word against theirs. I realized then how carefully Karen had cultivated fear. No one wanted to stand against her, especially if they risked facing these pseudo-cops. That meant I was on my own unless I could build a solid case. Meanwhile, the bureau grew more impatient. A supervisor from internal affairs summoned me to a brief meeting. She asked pointed questions about my aggressive behavior with local authorities, referencing a typed report full of half-truths. I stated my side of the story, but she simply tapped her pen on the folder and said, "We're reviewing all angles." My chest felt tight as I left her office. Even if I was telling the truth, the repeated complaints made me look like a liability. Karen was winning this round, using her phony goons and fake citations to undermine my credibility. My only solace was that Tamara still believed me, though she was too afraid to speak up in a formal way. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found an envelope taped to my front door. It bore a counterfeit seal, and inside was a notice claiming I'd violated Community Ordinance 301. The penalty, a hefty fine or further corrective measures. My patience snapped. I slammed the envelope on my kitchen table and called Karen's number, leaving a furious voicemail demanding she stop her harassment. An hour later my phone buzzed. The number was blocked. "Don't threaten Karen again," a voice hissed. "We know your boss, and we can make your life difficult." The line went dead before I could speak. Rage coiled in my gut as I realized these people were well connected, or at least wanted me to believe they were. Late that night, I peered out my window at the quiet street. Porch lights glimmered and a breeze rustled across neatly trimmed lawns. If anyone glanced over, they'd see a picture, perfect suburb, but I felt trapped in a twisted game with Karen pulling the strings. I was no closer to proving her scam, and the clock was ticking on my FBI career. My phone chimed with an email from a colleague. "Heads up, internal review might launch soon. Rumors are swirling. Green other storm on the horizon," and I was still stuck battling a neighbor who'd found a frightening way to seize power. As I shut off my lights, I couldn't help but wonder what Karen's next move would be, and whether I'd stand any chance once she made it. Even though I'd discovered the private security link, I still had no solid proof tying Karen to the scheme or clearing my name at the FBI. My only lead was the plate number Alvarez traced. But without neighbors brave enough to step forward, I stood on shaky ground, and Karen was ready to push me over the edge. Tension clung to my every move, and the stress of being under scrutiny at the FBI only intensified my fear of Karen's next strike. Whenever I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. Sometimes from neighbors who'd turned suspicious, sometimes from that unmarked car lurking at the corner. Late one afternoon, I headed out to buy groceries, hoping a quick errand would clear my head. As I pulled out of my driveway, I noticed a figure behind Karen's hedge, possibly keeping watch. The realization that my own neighborhood had become enemy territory made my stomach knot. Halfway to the store, my phone buzzed with an unknown caller. I hesitated, then answered. A gravelly voice said, "Stop digging or else." Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me with an uneasy chill in my chest. After the grocery run, I got home to find a crumpled flyer jammed under my wiper. It read, "Oh, police volunteers needed," listing a meeting date and Karen's address, so she was recruiting more help now, luring neighbors into her web of phony authority. The bottom of the page mentioned a membership fee to cover uniform costs. I shuddered at how blatant it was. If even a handful of people fell for her pitch, she'd have an entire squad of bully enforcers roaming the block. I snapped a photo of the flyer for evidence, then tore it up, not wanting it to float around my yard. As I walked up my steps, I noticed the blinds in Karen's window move slightly. She was probably watching me, but I didn't care. I shut my front door and bolted it tight. Inside, I spread my scattered notes on the dining table, trying to build a timeline of her takeover. There were dozens of warnings, fines, and bogus citations. Some were directed at me, others Tamara had shared. A pattern emerged. Each piece looked like a stepping stone, systematically chipping away at normal HOA processes until Karen could claim everything ran through her. She'd created a vacuum of confusion, then filled it with her own made-up structure. The question was why, or more importantly, who else stood behind her? The voice on the phone that kept warning me didn't sound like any neighbor I recognized. It had a menace that suggested real muscle, and that meant someone with resources had her back. That evening, I invited Tamara over so we could piece together what we knew. She arrived with a thick envelope of her own documents. I found old newsletters that mentioned Karen taking over the events committee. She said, sitting down at my table. At the time, we thought she just wanted to manage block parties and yard sales. Now I see she had bigger goals. I flipped through some of the pages, shaking my head in disbelief. It's like she's been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment. Tamara's hands trembled as she pointed out a line from a 6-month-old letter. Local security guidelines will be enforced for the safety of all residents. It bore Karen's signature along with a vague reference to third-party officials. Tamara placed her hand over mine. "Do you think any part of this is legal?" she asked, voice tight with worry. I shook my head. No, but nobody's stopping her. We shared a grim look. Even the real board was out of the picture, either silent or forced into hiding, and the police wouldn't act without clear evidence of criminal wrongdoing. As for the bureau, I was stuck behind layers of internal reviews. The next day, I decided to visit Alvarez in person. Maybe if I showed him the collected documents, he'd see the scope of Karen's plot. I drove to the station, the flyer and citations stacked in a manila folder on my passenger seat. My heart rattled in my chest, worried that someone might follow me. At a stoplight, I spotted a black sedan with tinted windows behind me. It lingered too long when the light turned green, raising my suspicions. Once I reached the station and parked, the sedan slowed, then turned down a side street. My pulse pounded, convinced I'd just been tailed. Inside, Alvarez ushered me into a cramped office. "Sorry for the mess," he said. "We're short on space right now." I placed the folder on his desk and explained everything: the calls, the flyers, the brand new push for more fake officers, the rumor that they were collecting money. He glanced through the pages, whistling under his breath. "This is bigger than I thought, but how do we pin it on Karen?" I leaned in. "We have her name on multiple documents, plus neighbors who can testify. If you need statements, I can gather them." Alvarez frowned. "Would need them in writing, and these folks can't be too scared to sign their names. Otherwise, it's just hearsay." A heavy sigh left me. My neighbors were terrified of crossing Karen, and I couldn't blame them. For all I knew, she had real power somewhere, or at least powerful friends. I asked Alvarez about the tinted SUV plates again, hoping there was more to learn. He scanned his computer. "It's registered to a private security firm with ties to an out-of-state corporation. Could be some shell company, hard to trace." My shoulders sagged. "So basically a dead end." He nodded, grim-faced. "I can keep digging, but unless they break the law in a way we can prove, we're stuck." I swallowed my frustration and thanked him, though it felt like I was no closer to stopping Karen. On my way out, my phone buzzed. A text from my supervisor: "We need to talk ASAP. Be here first thing tomorrow." My mind spun with worst-case scenarios. Maybe the phony HOA squad had filed another complaint against me, or Karen had found a new way to sabotage my record. That night I barely slept. My thoughts whirled with a sense of impending doom, sure that Karen would strike again in some unexpected way. Around 200 in the morning, I jolted upright to the sound of a car door slamming outside. I crept to the window and peeked out. A figure stood by the curb, looking at my house. For a heartbeat, I worried it was Karen. But the silhouette seemed different, taller and bulkier. After a moment, they climbed back into a vehicle and drove off, leaving me rattled and wide awake. The next morning, I dragged myself to the bureau, bracing for whatever my supervisor had to say. He was waiting by his office door, arms folded. "This is bad," he muttered, ushering me inside. I sat down, my gut tight. "I've got a dozen complaint forms in front of me," he said, dropping a file onto his desk. "All from your neighborhood, all accusing you of misconduct, threats, even property damage." My mouth went dry. "Property damage?" He rubbed his temples. "I know, but it's in black and white. Official statements with addresses and signatures." My head spun. Karen had clearly pressured neighbors into signing whatever she wanted them to sign. Now it looked like my entire community was turning against me. The supervisor shook his head. "I believe you when you say this is a setup, but the higher-ups see a pattern. This is going to escalate unless we figure out the truth. And soon." I tried to keep a handle on my anger. "Give me a chance to prove these people are impersonators. They're not recognized by any real authority." He nodded slowly. "All right, but we can't shield you forever. Internal affairs is breathing down my neck. A grim silence settled between us. I thanked him for his patience, knowing time was running out. As I left the office, I fought a surge of desperation. Karen was strangling my career with her cunning moves. At this rate, I'd be fired or put on indefinite leave before I could expose her. I thought about how easily she'd convince neighbors to file false statements. Fear, bribes, intimidation. Whatever method she used, they worked, and I was the lone target. By the time I drove home late in the day, I felt emotionally wrung out. The fake cruiser was back on my street, parked right outside my house with its lights off. I exited my car and approached it, determined to confront them once and for all. A figure rolled down the window just an inch, and a harsh voice snarled, "Back off or you'll regret it." My heart hammered. The threat was clear, but so was my resolve. Karen's twisted empire of fear had to be dismantled, and I couldn't let her win. My job teetered on the edge and my neighborhood had turned hostile, but I still needed proof that Karen was the puppet master behind these bogus enforcers. The stakes couldn't be higher, and I knew I was heading straight into a confrontation that might cost me everything. I drove to FBI headquarters with my pulse hammering, bracing for the worst. My supervisor had told me about an official inquiry into my so-called misconduct, and I was already running on fumes. Weeks of harassment, false reports, and tension with Karen's phony patrol had left me exhausted and jittery. As I walked into the large, echoing lobby, I noticed people giving me wary looks. News of my troubles had spread, and it felt like I was wearing a giant target. A tight knot formed in my chest. I tried to steady my breathing and remind myself that the truth was on my side. When I reached the conference room, an agent I barely knew opened the door and led me inside. At the long table sat a panel of higher-ups, each wearing a stern expression. My supervisor stood near the back, arms folded, looking grim. An older agent cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the numerous complaints against you. They involve alleged threats to neighborhood authorities and repeated refusals to obey local laws." My heart pounded. "Those authorities are fakes," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "Their badges aren't real, and the HOA never approved them." One of the panelists, a steely woman, lifted a thick file. "We have statements from at least 10 neighbors claiming otherwise. They say you bullied them." My blood boiled. "I have documents proving this is a setup. The so-called HOA police belong to a private security firm with no legal standing." The panel exchanged glances, but their expressions stayed guarded. Suddenly, the door swung open and in walked Karen. She wore a suit, not her usual casual clothes, and carried a sleek briefcase. My mouth fell open in shock. "What is she doing here?" I blurted, my voice raw with disbelief. One of the agents cleared his throat. "Miss Garrett has submitted evidence on behalf of the local enforcement group." My mind spun. So Karen was invited to testify against me in an official FBI inquiry. She stepped forward, calm and collected. "Good morning," she said, sounding far too polished. "I represent the interests of our community. I'd like to correct a few misunderstandings." My supervisor shot me a stunned look. He hadn't warned me Karen might appear. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Karen opened her briefcase and produced a neat folder. "These files include reports from the neighborhood watch," she explained, laying them on the table. "They show repeated noise complaints, suspicious activity, and even a few alleged break-ins linked to this agent's address." I bristled. "That's a lie," I snapped, but she continued without missing a beat. "We asked him many times to cooperate with our volunteer police program, yet he refused, claiming we lacked authority." She let out a delicate sigh. "We only wanted to keep our streets safe." I stared at the panel, struggling to keep my voice level. Karen is not telling the truth. She started this scheme months ago, scaring neighbors into supporting her. She's using false citations to squeeze money out of them. I've even seen the fake forms." The steely woman on the panel raised a brow. "Do you have these forms with you?" My heart dropped. "Not physically, but I emailed them too." Karen shook her head, feigning disappointment. "I'm afraid we have no record of that." Perhaps the agent is confused. My anger surged. She was better prepared than I expected, weaving a story that painted me as a rogue agent. Then came the twist that made my jaw drop. The older agent turned to Karen and said, "Before we proceed, we should disclose your family connection." Karen gave a curt nod. "Yes, of course." She glanced at me with a pitying smile. "My uncle is the deputy director of this bureau. I tried to handle this matter quietly, but when your behavior escalated, I had no choice but to bring it to his attention." My stomach lurched. The deputy director was near the top of our chain of command. If he was her uncle, that explained everything. How she shut down the real HOA's lines, how my neighbors felt powerless, and how she'd managed to file official complaints that reached my supervisors so fast. One panelist cleared his throat. "Given Miss Garrett's connection, we must ensure impartiality, but these claims are serious. Agent, can you provide concrete proof of criminal activity?" My voice wavered. "I have records showing the security firm is unlicensed, and neighbors who've told me they're being extorted. But they're too scared to come forward." Karen pressed her lips together. "My family and I care deeply about law and order. We only encourage people to keep our streets safe." Every word dripped with insincerity. My vision swam, realizing she had deeper roots in the agency itself. I stood alone, cornered by her well-placed influence. The meeting ended with a promise that internal affairs would launch a formal investigation, not just of me, but also of any possible wrongdoing in Karen's group. Yet I walked away feeling like I'd lost ground. Karen beamed at me on her way out, murmuring, "Better watch your step." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to shout in front of my superiors. My supervisor jogged after me in the hallway. "I had no idea she was related to the deputy director," he muttered. "This puts us in a tight spot. You're not off the hook." I exhaled shakily. "I know." He gave me a sympathetic look. "Do yourself a favor. Stay calm and gather any evidence you can. We'll need more than hearsay." I left the building in a daze trying to process this shock. Karen's uncle was one of the highest-ranking officers in the FBI. That meant she had access to connections and resources I never dreamed of. If she could convince my neighbors to back her, what could she do with her uncle's power behind her? My knees felt weak as I reached my car. There was no guarantee Internal Affairs would believe me now. Not when Karen had official channels on her side. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so